Alright, so imagine there's some random web app out there asking you to upload an image. Let's take a dating app for example. Now, unfortunately, you have two images of yours sitting side by side in your system. The first image is basically the best version of yourself, but the second one, let's call it unflattering for the lack of a better word. Now, you'd not want any soul on this planet to look at that second image, but what if you accidentally upload it? I mean, sure, you can remove it then and there, but it's now out on the internet. You'll never have sound sleep knowing that it can at any time be leaked and just the thought of it makes you uneasy. Now, luckily, file upload APIs normally take some time, which means if at all there's some mechanism that can cancel an API request midway, we can use that to protect everyone's dignity. And that's exactly what we are going to look at in this video, the AbortController API. So this native API can help you cancel unnecessary or long-running network requests, which frees up system resources and hence enhances your user experience. Just by looking at the problem that this API solves, you'll also realize that it helps in improving performance by discarding requests that are no longer needed. I mean, if an API is taking too long to resolve, which in turn blocks some part of the UI that you want to use, having freedom to cancel that request and do something else instead is just good user experience. So clearly there's a lot of pros in using this API. So let's just see how to do it. Just like pretty much any video on this channel, I again have a simple React app here, nothing fancy. I have a simple router set up inside the main.tsx file. This handles the root route, which points to the app component. And there's one more route, which is a dynamic route. So it's going to render the user profile info, and the dynamic component here is user ID. I have a separate component for this user profile. Inside the app file, there's only a bunch of links that point to different user IDs. So whenever a user clicks on any one of these links, you route to a different page, which is this route, and it will have some basic user information. This information comes from this user profile.tsx file, and it's a pretty common React component. A lot of patterns that you see here, I'm sure you'd be using them on a day-to-day basis. So all this component does is make an API call to fetch the user. If it resolves successfully, then it's storing it inside this user state. If you get an error, it's storing that error inside this error state. And finally, it's setting the loader to false. So the moment the route is loaded, this is going to run and it's going to set the loading to true. Only when the API is resolved successfully or if there's an error, will this loading be set to false. Once the API resolves or throws an error, finally we just set this loading state to false. And based on these three states, we conditionally display respective JSX content. So nothing new here. It's a pretty straightforward component. Inside the browser, if you take a look at the app, it's just a list of users. And anytime I click on any one of these users, I see the username and email. That's it. It's a pretty straightforward application. And just for this example, I'm going to bring down the network speed to slow 4G, because only when we have a gap between the API call and its resolution, we'll be able to cancel it. And my network speed is pretty fast here, so it's going to be a challenge to cancel these requests midway. That's the reason why for this example, I'm setting it to slow 4G. Let's get back to the example. To integrate the AbortController into our app, we'll have to follow three steps. First, we'll create an instance of AbortController, which is a class that's provided by JavaScript, and we'll pass its signal to the fetch request. Let's do that first, and I'll come back to what exactly this signal does. The first thing I'll do is create an instance of the AbortController inside this effect, and inside this fetch request, we have an option to pass in the options object. So inside there, I'll simply pass in signal, and the value of that signal is going to be controller.signal. So the signal that we pass to this fetch method is an instance of the abort signal class, which is also part of the AbortController API. The signal is the mechanism that allows the fetch request to listen for cancellation commands. So somewhere inside your use effect, you'll call this abort method eventually. I'll come to that in a second. This abort method is present on the AbortController, and this signal will notify the fetch request that it should be cancelled. Where exactly do I call this abort method? Great question. That's also the second step for us. So we have to abort this function during cleanup. The controller.abort function call should happen in the cleanup function so that if the component unmounts or if the user ID changes before the request is complete, the ongoing API call will be cancelled. So to do that, I'll simply return a function. This is going to handle the cleanup of this use effect. And inside this function, I am going to call controller.abort. So now anytime this component, which is the user profile, which is also this route, anytime this route unmounts, it's going to cancel the request. If at all that request is in that ongoing phase. If it's already resolved, then it's not really going to do anything. But if at all the API request is ongoing, the controller is going to abort that request with the help of this method. Now the third and the final step deals with errors. So what we are going to do here inside this block, we are first going to differentiate between a normal error and an abort error. If the request is aborted, we don't treat it as an error that needs to be displayed to the user. So if I go back to the application and if I try to search for, say, user ABC, ABS, or whatever this is, you'll see that we get an error here. We are displaying something here because we are setting the error message over here. Now, in case of abort error, we are not planning to show the user the error message. We simply want to abort that request and go back to wherever the user intends to go to. Only when it's not an abort error but something else to do with this fetch API call, we'll set it to this error object and we'll display it to the user. So let's handle that. I'll just simply replace this piece of code with this. So anytime it's an abort error, just simply console log saying that the request was aborted. But if it's something else, then simply set it to the error message and this is what will be displayed over here. And that should ideally do it. Let me save this file and go back to the browser. Let's go back to the list of users. Okay, we have the list of users here. Now what I'll do is I'll try to go to this user's profile. And even before the API that fetches the user details resolves, I'll try to come back to this route. So this means that I'm trying to unmount the user profiles page for this user. And I am coming back on this list page. And if there's an unmount operation for that user profile component, then ideally it should also call the abort method. So let's bring this down to 3Gs just so that we can see it in action. So I'll go to user one. You see the request here. I come back. It actually did resolve.
Fucking idiot.
I could have done this better. I should ideally do it a little quicker. So let's go to user two. Yeah, you see here that it got cancelled because even before it was able to resolve it, the component unmounted, and that's why abort method was called, which aborted this request. If I do it with user 3 and come back, you'll see the same thing here. This means that our abort controller is working as expected. Anytime the component unmounts, it calls the abort method and it cancels the request. Now for folks who use Tanstack query in their application, you can still use the abort controller in conjunction with it. We can actually trim a lot of code with Tanstack query. So what I'll do is I'll install it inside this application. Okay, this is installed. Now we'll have to add the provider at the root level. So I'll go back to main.tsx, and in here, let's first create a query client and we'll wrap the router provider with the query client provider. All right, so this is done. Now inside the user profile component, let's first move the fetch logic outside of this component. Since it's an independent operation, we don't really need to have it inside this component, inside this use effect. So let's do that first. I'll create a separate function called fetch user and I'll put it outside this component. Now inside here, I'll simply use the use query hook that's provided by React Query. Let me import it and let's bring this user ID at the top. Now by doing this, we can get rid of all these state values and I can also remove this entire use effect. We don't really need this anymore. Inside the JSX, let me just change loading to is loading and error to is error. This error now will become error.message and that should do it. We have React Query in place. Now to add the abort controller to this, all we have to do is use the signal that we get out of the box from the query function params. Also, if you're not familiar with this use query hook, I'll explain it to you in short. I actually have an entire series around Tanstack query, which is linked in the description if you want to check it out. But in short, you use this use query hook to handle get requests, and there's one more hook called use mutation, which we normally use to make any updates to the database. The use query hook takes a query key and a query function. You see here that we have a query key which is user and user ID. So it's actually one query key with a static component and a dynamic component. The result from this query function, this function, is stored against this query key in the browser memory. Browser has its own separate memory. That's where this result is stored against this query key. This result acts as a cached response for the request for a while. After that duration, it makes a new request to the backend and replaces the cache with this new fresh copy. That's basically the gist of this use query hook. But do watch the series to get a more deeper understanding, as there's a lot of nuance to it. So yeah, now that we have the hook in place and we have all the use states and use effects removed, let's add the signal. So inside this query function, we get access to the signal param, and I can directly pass it inside this fetch user function. Now I need to use it here. So it's going to be signal, which is of type bot signal. And I can use this inside this fetch function, just like we did earlier. And that's it. If I save this and go back to the browser, again, it's pretty much going to look the same because functionality wise, everything is more or less the same. It's just that we have used Tanstack query now, which is basically handling all the states for us and also brings in caching as a bonus. If I go back and try to open up user one and come back, you'll see that it gets cancelled. Similarly, for any other route, it's going to behave the same way. If I wait for a while and let this resolve, then yeah, it's going to resolve by default. So unless you need custom behavior, you don't need to explicitly define an abort controller with React query because it already uses one under the hood. So yeah, that's how you'd use an abort controller in a React app along with Tanstack query. This is a very useful API which has a lot of important use cases. So feel free to give it a try and play around with it. Also do subscribe to the channel for similar content, and I'll see you in the next one.